Hello, and welcome to the Feeding Pod. This is your host. I'm Brianna Millick, and I am a speech language pathologist and certified lactation counselor. I specialize in infant and medically complex feeding and primarily see patients in the home health setting, although I do have some that I see in outpatient or via telepractice. I'm also an instructor at the university level and a PhD student studying communication and information sciences. I have a huge passion for evidence-based practice and supporting information literacy in speech, language, hearing, feeding, swallowing sciences, specifically as it pertains to social media and translational research. This podcast is meant to share anything and everything related to being a pediatric feeding SLP, feeding therapist, with sprinkling in a little bit about working in academia, being a PhD student, and how to access, appraise, and implement research into clinical practice. Some episodes may contain guests, and I'm already looking forward to some of those coming up, while others might just be me rambling about something that's been on my mind. Regardless, my goal with this podcast is that you walk away not just with newfound knowledge, but with the inspiration to think critically and not be afraid of research. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to the Feeding Pod. This is Bree, and I'm so excited to have Dr. Katherine Sanchez back today. I just adore her so much. And if you don't already know by now, she is one of the mentors in the Advanced Pediatric Feeding Mentorship Group. And that's because she just brings so much clinical and research experience in. And I think that's really important for everybody that's part of the group. But I also value that so much as Katherine being a friend of mine. So I'm so happy you're back. I keep bringing you back. I keep being like, we've got more to say. We've got more to talk about. So,
Australian boomerang, there's that whole analogy.
Yeah, there it is. That's what it is. It's going to come back around every single time. And I feel like always the discussions we have are they're very nuanced, which I think is fun to talk about in this field. So Katherine, why don't you kind of give everybody just a quick reintroduction new introduction if they haven't listened to one of your episodes before, but just kind of give a brief overview of, some of your experiences and then what you're kind of into now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I live in Melbourne, Australia. So if you're hearing the accent, that's why. I have my own private practice, Therapeutic, where pretty much all of my clients now have sort of complex pediatric feeding disorders, including dysphagia. And I also provide sort of mentorship and supervision to clinicians in those spaces, as well as in implementing EBP in the pediatric feeding space. I did my PhD, finished that 4 years ago. I calculate it by the age of my youngest child, who was born just finished.
I love that.
And that was in communication and feeding outcomes in children born before 30 weeks of gestational age. So that was an opportunity for me to really dive into the literature around kids with medical complexity and their sort of outcomes once they get out into the community. And I think really sparked my interest in that area, as well as working in private practice. Obviously, as you said, I'm a mentor in the Advanced Pediatric Feeding Mentorship Group. And I'm also the special topics editor for the pediatric medical topics at the Informed SLP, where we sort of translate research into clinically actionable information.
Yes, I love that. And I even had a note written down to re-bring up the Informed SLP, because a lot of the stuff we're talking about, I think the Informed SLP really helps you problem solve through a lot of this in taking that information. So what we're going to talk about today is really going through understanding outcome measurements in research, talking about what outcome measurements researchers use, why maybe they choose the outcome measurements they do, and then how those outcome measurements are applicable or valuable or even matter to clinicians, and what type of outcome measures really make a difference for our patient and client care. And so before we kind of get into the fun part, let's just talk about outcome measurements in general. Okay. So Katherine, give us just what do we mean by outcome measurements, and what maybe types of outcome measurements would people be more familiar with?
Yeah, absolutely. So outcome measurements, they do what they say on the tin, right? We're looking at the outcomes usually of a therapeutic intervention, and we're measuring that in some sort of formal way. So there can be lots of different types of outcome measurement. You might use something quite formal and standardized, but there are lots of other ways to measure outcomes as well. In the feeding space, we have a lot of PROMs, patient reported outcome measures, although they tend to be by proxy, so caregiver questionnaires that are standardized and that can help us sort of measure outcomes over time. But there are also tools like goal attainment scaling or GAS and other types of sort of outcome measurements. OSTOMS is one that we have in Australia that you can use to sort of focus more holistically on the person or the child. And I guess the importance of that is, firstly, we want to know that what we're doing is working or that it's not working, because then we need to change things up. So it's really important to have a bit of a metric around.
The dog just walked indoors, let herself in.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's like that video with the kid in the bouncer and the news guy in the.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, from the pandemic. So yeah, we want to know whether what we're doing is working or not working, so that we can change our plans accordingly. But also, outcome measurements can be really important for funding, for proving yourself to insurance or other funding bodies to provide evidence that it's worthwhile them continuing to pay you. So they have really practical uses, and then of course they're very useful and necessary in the research space as well, because when we're testing a new intervention, we need to know whether it does anything or not.
Yeah. And I think that's where outcome measurements, we think about it a lot more in like the research space. I think when we hear that term a lot of the time, it's like, okay, what they were managing, what was the effect of this type of intervention? Like, what was the outcome from it? But we use outcome measurements constantly in clinical practice as well. And so this is one that really carries over. And one of the things that, stood out to me that you said is sort of, how do we determine, I'm trying to remember exactly how you said it, but basically thinking about like, we're considering like the success of therapy, right? So thinking about like this outcome measurement means that we are successful and progressing toward a functional outcome. And how do we really determine which outcome measurement is what direction we should be going in? I think that where it goes into like looking at some of those more like holistic versions or even like value-based outcomes, I think can be really valuable. I'd love to hear you talk on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to look at this space and look at what outcome measurements we're choosing and why. Because if you're choosing it for sort of that practical, I want to prove myself to ensure a reason, then you're probably going to choose like a standardized tool that gives you a numeric outcome that is really sort of obvious to demonstrate in your documentation. But if it's more for the purpose of sort of measuring whether what you're doing is working, and working from whose perspective, right? Like, and who are you trying to show it to? Are you trying to show it to yourself? Are you trying to show it to your supervisor? Are you trying to show it to the parent? Then it becomes really important to be selective about what you're choosing. You don't want to just go in and say, all right, well, I'm going to use the PEDI as an outcome measurement for every child, because maybe it doesn't align properly with the goals that you're working on. And so I think, that there's a whole range of different outcome measurement tools in the space, in the pediatric feeding space, that we can draw on to be really specific about what we're doing. And I know you and I both really like the infant feeding care range of tools that used to be called the feeding flop tools.
Yeah.
But, I think they're a really good example, because you've got ones that are like about mealtime family functioning, and then you've got ones that are about oral motor skills. And the one that you select for your outcome measurement is going to be different depending on what you have been working on with that child and what the goals of the family are. Do they really want the child to be able to chew more efficiently, or do they really want the child to be able to participate in family celebrations? And that, I think it's really important to be considering that. There's a great recent systematic review as well that Dr. Jean Marshall has just published, looking at PROMs, patient reported outcome measurements, in the specifically focusing on the feeding skill domain of pediatric feeding disorder. So there's some nice ones in there to
I think
look
it's
at.
really interesting too with the PROMs and thinking about like how I do not remember who wrote this article, or like I would have to like do my little search in my Zotero, but there was one that talked about how there's like a disconnect, or there tends to be like significantly different ratings if you use like very similar outcome measurements and had like a caregiver rate how feeding's going versus the feeding therapist rate how feeding's going, and like looking at the different skills alongside it and how there's this mismatch. And so I think that also goes into where when we're using tools like that to support like navigating what direction we might go in with therapy or where we find the strengths and the weaknesses, that's where we also can't only rely on the tool to serve like what is going to be the most functional outcome for this child and family, because there could be a total discrepancy in what we think should be a priority and what actually matters to them.
Absolutely. And I think, what you're speaking to is that capacity versus performance dichotomy, right? Like if anyone hasn't read our amazing piece on motor feeding that you and I and Kristen put together, we spoke about it a little bit there, that you have to think about whether you want to focus on capacity, which is what can a child do in a highly controlled, supported environment, like in a clinic room where they have the perfect seating and no distractions, and the parents have made sure to bring them in hungry and rested, and versus what can they do from a performance perspective in the real world where things are messy and and literally and figuratively, and it's not always the perfect circumstances because their lives are not capacity, their lives are performance. So we need to be thinking about that with outcome measurements. And that's why I think proms can be so useful in the feeding space, because we don't really, it is interesting to know what they can do in the clinic, but what makes a difference to their lives is what they're doing day to day at home, at childcare, in all of the other places where they function through the day.
Yeah. And I think it reflects on even like proms can reflect on even more than what the child's skill is, but also like how the caregivers feel about what's happening. And I think, we've had conversations about this and I've talked with others as well. I think I've probably mentioned it on the podcast too, of like that psychosocial piece is often so quickly overlooked when in reality, like that could play an even larger role in the skills developing, or that like discrepancy piece of like, how do they view what's going on versus what is actually going on. And I think that's where proms can play a role in that as well, because you are getting that caregiver report or patient report, depending on if they can report it. I know most of the kids we work with are littles or may have trouble communicating that. So paying attention to, how do they feel about it? And I think that also goes just into our interventions as well. Like when we make a recommendation, just how do you feel about that recommendation? Do you feel that that's something would work for your family? This kind of makes me think about what we were talking about in Slack earlier this week when you had mentioned how you will phrase your questions and ask questions to help guide caregivers in really determining like what is best for them and their family versus you giving like a direct, instruction to them on how to make things better.
Absolutely. And I actually think this leads so nicely into thinking about whether goal attainment scaling is like a useful tool for you in your clinic, because that's a really great tool for having those discussions with families as well and really aligning your expectations. So for people who haven't come across it before, goal attainment scaling, or GAS, is basically where you sit down when you are setting goals with a family and you say, okay, so our goal is we want to expand their texture variety, and then we want to expand the number of the types of textures that they are accepting. So what would it look like if we made absolutely no progress on this goal? And then we write that down and we score that as 0. And then we say, okay, and then what would it look like if we made amazing progress on this goal and just met it to every expectation and dream that you have for therapy? And then we rate that, and usually that's like a 2. And then we're like, okay, so what does it look like if we're like in between no progress and a 2? What would a 1 look like for us? And then we write that down and we define it really closely. And then we go and say, like, well, what about if things get worse? Like, what if this child's seizures increase, or they go on a new medication, or they're just tired and sick and things go backwards. Let's put in a negative one there. And you just build up this scale of what would the outcomes actually look like to you? What are the outcomes that are important to you? How can we define those and really operationalize those really closely? And then you end up with an outcome measurement that's completely tailored to that family, and you get to have those really nuanced, deep conversations about their expectations of therapy, and you put a timeline on it as well. So you like,
Yeah.
in what are your wildest expectations that we could achieve in a 3-month period of, of seeing you weekly? So yeah, I think that can be a really amazing tool to be very tailored and individualized to the clients.
I love that. And I feel like it's something that you could use. So, for example, in the States, if someone is in early intervention, the goals are quite literally written by the families. Like you ask the family, what do you want your child to do? And they write that in there. Many states don't even worry about if it's super measurable or not. They just kind of like, I want them to eat more foods, and they just like throw that in there. However, I think this is something that could be used in that type of setting, right? To help caregivers navigate that, to come up with goals that are, in line with how they feel with what's going on and what's causing them the most concern. But then also clinically, I'm thinking about, if I was to write a goal like child will eat more foods, insurance would be like, what does that mean? Like, how are you measuring that? Where are you going through that? And so I think using that to help understand like what the caregiver's priorities are, but then us using our clinical experience to say, okay, here's how we can make this measurable so that we can still, submit to insurance while still focusing on what the caregiver cares about and still, going into that direction. Like we can provide the nuance to make sure that we show the medical necessity of it, but we can still make sure like our functional outcome that we're working toward achieving is based on what they need and what's best for them.
Yeah,
that's cool. Very cool. I will make sure to link that in the show notes for everybody to look into.
Fantastic. I think it's such a good tool, and it's so widely used in OT and physical therapy, but I'm not sure that we use it as widely in speech pathology outside of those really like transdisciplinary programs. So I think it's like an untapped resource for us that it would be really interesting to see it being used more.
Absolutely. I think that would really help better align our therapy goals with family goals and what they want to see in outcomes. So let's move into talking about how aligning these goals, so aligning our outcome measurements for therapy, really how they can affect the patient, the family, and the healthcare provider. Because I think it can affect like the whole everybody in more than one way. Now we've kind of touched on the fact that like, okay, it makes sure that the care we're providing is more family centered and is more patient centered or patient driven, but like, why does that matter? Right. And so how does that really affect therapy as a whole?
Yeah, and I think probably a huge part of this is buy-in, right? Like making sure that families, if you have a family that feels like they're being listened to and that they have come in with these goals, and you're like, okay, well, here's how I'm planning on meeting these goals, and here's how I'm going to measure whether we're actually meeting these goals at these time periods. If a family has that really clear direction and they can link what you're doing in therapy and what the home practice is with that direction, they're much more likely to be completing the home practice because they can see that it's purposeful. It's not just, some random activity that you've swept in and told them that they have to do for their child's development, because you linked it all in. You've said, okay, well, your goal is that you want your child to be able to come to the table at your Christmas dinner and, and maybe have something on their plate and, and be part of that Christmas meal. Okay, so let's what skills do we need to get there, and how can we meet each skill, and how does our home practice help you meet that skill that eventually works towards that Christmas dinner outcome? So I think, the family's going in feeling heard and feeling purposeful and feeling like you're all part of the team together. It's not the child has a team that's composed of professionals. It's the child has a team that includes the child and the parent, and everyone is on the same page and everyone's working towards the same goal. I think that's so critical. And I have definitely encountered parents who have come to me and fed back that, you know, they might have been in a program where they didn't feel like they had a clear direction, where they were, you know, coming in and maybe they were doing food play, or, you know, or maybe they were doing, you know, eating every week when they came in, but they didn't know what they were working towards, and they didn't know whether anything was improving. And it's really hard to feel committed when that's the case, when you don't know where things are moving to, or where they should be moving to, or whether they're getting there. I think it gives us some accountability as healthcare providers as well, to think, okay, well, we said by X date that we were going to be aiming for this, and, you know, and so this is what we need to sort of get through if we're going to meet that goal. And of course, you're not always going to meet the goal that you've set. You know, things get in the way, life gets in the way, kids can change, situations can change. But if you have that in the back of your mind, then I think that's really helpful for us as well, not to just get caught in, I'm just doing the same thing every week. You know, I'm getting out my favorite game because the kid likes it, and we're, you know, having a muck around and having a good time. You don't get caught in that sort
Not
of
like
bog.
complacent with just doing the same thing over and over, and yeah, not recognizing things aren't changing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I think the sort of one of the first points you made, where you were talking about like sitting with the family and saying like, okay, so like, this is your goal. Here's what I'm thinking about to as steps to get us there, as strategies to get us there. And we're always going to be doing all of these things to work toward there. And I truly think that that's something that I need to improve on, because a lot of times I'm like, you know, like, here's goals. Do those align? Do you feel good about these? Like, you know, based on what you say, it seems like you want to work on and like creating goals with the caregiver. But I feel like that's an area I need to improve on, is like revisiting them and saying, hey, you know how we started doing XYZ, or, you know, we did that. That's working towards this goal that we set up together, and like revisiting that over and over. I find myself like doing it when I like, you know, have to, because it's like progress note time. Let's talk about it. But it's something that I really need to integrate more. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad we're having this discussion, because it's helping me reflect too, to say like, okay, that's something that I could do better, is make the connections more frequently. And I think sometimes there's the barrier of like, you're in a session, so you feel like you have to do like just therapeutic stuff, you know, and like, we don't consider the fact that counseling the caregiver all the time is totally therapeutic in that nature. And if we're not counseling on a feeding strategy, that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean it's not helping with the long-term outcome. And so I think kind of changing my mindset with that, of like spending a little bit of time doing that, is helpful. And I actually, this past week sat down with a caregiver in a session, and we went over the child's IEP. So that's like the goals that the school system sets up. And we said, okay, based on the progress we made this summer, are these still okay? Do we need to change them? Let's go through them. What questions do you have? What concerns do you have? And we worked through it. And it's like, that's totally, you know, therapeutic, because we're counseling on the progress that's been made, making sure that moving forward, that the outcome measurements do make sense, and the child's going to get the supports that they need, but not too much support, because they've made progress, and kind of navigating that. So I appreciate
I think that's so important. And I think probably I spend more time on the sort of counseling like side of things than I do on doing the thing, you know, like I'm not spending, you know, the majority of my session feeding the kid in most cases. In most cases, I'm spending most of the time talking to the parents. And
if I am feeding, a lot of times I'm talking to the parent at the same time. So it's like, okay, now it's your turn. All right, you come in. Yeah,
exactly. And it's really, it's been interesting. This is a bit of a digression into like note writing, but I often talk to people about note writing and my notes. And very often, so when I structure my SOAP notes in my O section, I do it as like goal 1, what's the goal? And then a few dot points. Goal 2, what's the goal? And then a few dot points. And I almost always have a goal around, like I might have a goal around case management, which is, you know, we're talking about funding, or we're talking about, you know, what other professionals we might loop into. And I'll usually have at least a few dot points that are about the informational counseling that I have done. And when I do supervision and those sorts of things, I find that a lot of people are putting that in the S section of their SOAP notes, like the subjective section. Like they think of it as something that the parent is just reporting to them, like it's not intervention, like it's not something that they're sort of giving to the parents as part of their service. And I think that's really worth reframing, because I think that informational counselling is a really critical part of our intervention. It's not just parent report. Like,
I love that, because we know counseling is within our scope, like counseling on the things within our scope, right? Like if a caregiver additional support outside of what I can provide, then yes, I need to seek, but counseling on the very things we're doing and the reasons we're doing them, that totally makes sense. Like, how is that? I'm having a moment. That makes so much sense. So I always prioritize writing a caregiver goal, because I like the accountability it has on them of like, we're writing a goal that also like encourages your involvement and participation and carryover. But I never thought about writing a goal to like hit certain points that we've counseled through, that we've worked. I love that. I love that. That's so, yeah, because I totally put it in the subjective. I totally like any counseling that I do, it's either in the subjective or it's in like my plan of care for like next step. My recommendations moving forward is like, and then we talked about blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, that total, oh my God. I like this. I like this.
Yeah. I just, I can't even, I don't remember when I started doing it that way, because, you know, I had a bit of a sort of break from conventional clinical practice when I was doing my PhD, where I was mostly like, I was doing some groups and some outpatient clinics and stuff, but not having sort of sustained ongoing therapeutic work with kids. And so, so when I started my private practice, like this was just the way I started doing it, and it made sense to me. And then when I was doing supervision and people were like, oh, this is my note. And I was like, but like, 3/4 of your S is actually intervention, like is actually stuff that you are doing to support the family. You need to pull that into your O. Like that's, it was just really, because it hadn't occurred to me that would be a misalignment and what the implications of that were. But I think that it links really well into these outcome measures, because if you have outcome measurements like around functional outcomes or, you know, family goals, then a lot of the stuff that you do towards those functional goals is going to be informational counseling based and discussion.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I think, I mean, this is me just like literally having an epiphany moment, but so now my brain's like going in 100 directions, but
we'll just need a podcast episode break.
Yeah, right. I'm curious though, if part of the reason so many of us think of those as being subjective is because so many speech and language goals are written in very like objective terms. That's what you target in those strategies. And there's less of the counseling as with feeding. I feel like in pediatric feeding, so much of what I do is counseling and supporting the caregiver in, to apply something. And so I wonder if that's sort of where like so many of the teaching and trainings are around that. Whereas like you mentioned in like even talking about the gas and like OT is with, sorry, hold on. I gotta snooze. That's my cat's insulin alarm. I gotta go check him in a second. But I wonder if that's why like where OT focuses very heavily on like activities of daily living. And so in those situations, like that type of counseling and supporting through stuff, like I'm curious if they use that even more than speech language pathologists do. And if part of that's because of the nature of like the majority of the field.
That's interesting. It would be interesting to see whether there's a difference in how like clinicians that work on like early language, like, you know, like Hanani,
very caregiver heavy.
Exactly, very informational counseling, whether they would document any differently to the way that people who are, say, working on, you know, speech sounds.
Right. Well, I'm even thinking like setting wise, like speech sounds in the schools is going to be very different. Like you have very limited caregiver contact, if at all, as compared. So that is interesting. And I'm also going to start writing all those goals, and I'm supervising grad clinicians this semester, and I can't wait to tell them to write those goals. Like I'm so excited about this because what an important outcome measurement that I've been missing for so long. Like, you know, I'm doing it, but I'm measuring the fact that like, this is a very important part.
It's the core of what we're doing because it's all performance. Like,
Yep. And that's why I think my notes sometimes seem so heavy in the subjective, And it doesn't seem as heavy in like the data points and the objective piece because of the fact that that's, it's a dialogue that's happening most of the time. So
Yep.
really
And
interesting.
I mean, my feeding notes do end up being quite subjective heavy as well. But as I go through, my check is, if I have said anything to the family, it goes in the O section. If the family says it to me, it can stay in S, but anything that I'm saying, any new information that I'm bringing in, that needs to go in O, because that's an
Yeah.
intervention I'm offering.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. I think, like I said, a lot of the times I was kind of putting it into that like plan of care recommendation, like next step sort of thing. But I think putting that in the O with just like my immediate takeaways, like kind of just reformatting that, and also just like having a goal that talks about those specific things that we need to counsel through to show the progress toward the caregiver, because like all of those counseling things are leading toward the caregiver feeling more competent in what they're doing and feeling decreased, stress and anxiety around those meal times. So yeah, I love that. I love that. Okay. So another thing that I want to talk about is kind of just some examples of this. And I know we had talked about two specifically, if we're thinking about like outcome measurements that typically happen in things in different types of feeding therapy approaches, but also things that we see in the research as outcome measurements too. So, how, when we're looking at a research article that says, and I'll talk about our first example here. So the first example we were going to talk about is sort of like ABA, or behavior-based feeding therapy, and the outcome measurements that they use in those types of interventions. So when you have a child who goes to a clinic that implements these types of interventions, but also the research also tends to, show some of the same types of outcome measurements. So can you give an example of both and kind of why this may or may not be good, clinically what we're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and this is what really got us thinking about this topic, right, is looking at outcome measurement in the research and how that can impact on the way that you interpret and apply the research, because you can get this whole body of sort of literature that's like, this is the best feeding therapy approach. But in your process of reading the papers and critiquing the evidence, you should examine the outcome measures, because they can sometimes not align with the outcome measurements that you might be thinking about for the goals that your clients have. For example, one thing that we can see in a lot of papers is that a major outcome measure is bites accepted. So if I offer you this bite on the spoon, do you physically take it with your mouth? And how many bites are accepted? And maybe it goes up from 0 bites accepted on average at the start of the intervention to, 30 bites accepted on average at the end of the intervention. And then they're like, look, our therapy works because it's increased the number of bites accepted. If you drill down into that and think, okay, who is my client and what do I want for them? What do their parents want for them? What is going to be helpful to them in their lives? Is it bites accepted? Like,
I also think this is a total like side note, but the whole bites accepted or bites tolerated makes me because like, what does that mean? What does accepted mean? Like, we accepted it because it was the only option we had in order to discontinue a mealtime. It was the only option we had to not be ignored, or, and yeah, that's a side note, but I think that goes into what you're saying of like, does this align at all with what the family really wants?
Yeah. And I don't think it is a side note. I think it is a middle note, center note.
An interjection, maybe that's what it was. Relevant, but I just had to interrupt you because I was feeling it.
Yeah, no, totally. And we should be looking at these outcome measurements in the research that we're looking at to see what interventions we should be offering. And we should be thinking, are these outcome measurements value aligned for our families? Are they going to work towards what our families are looking for? Is bites accepted going to contribute to my child can sit with us at Christmas dinner? Are they going to contribute to my child can safely attend daycare, with the meals that are served there? I don't know, maybe not. But I think in a lot of cases, we're extrapolating this research in a really sort of gross way, big, unnuanced way. I don't mean disgusting, but
that too sometimes.
Sometimes. But, we look at this research and we're like, oh, okay, well, they had a change from point A to point B. And so this therapy is effective. And so I should use this therapy with my clients. But in actual fact, we need to think more about the outcome measures that are used in research, because it's not always applicable to our clients for lots of different reasons.
Yeah. And I think too, sometimes when we see some of these like research pieces, I'm thinking specifically about when we see these like behavior-based approaches where there's an outcome of like, bites have increased. What these programs are doing are not very sustainable for a caregiver to do in the home and carry on. From clinical experience, I had a kid one time who went through an intensive behavior program. And when they came to see me, I'm like, because one of the first things they do in an eval is like, just show me what a mealtime looks like. Like, I'm going to be totally hands off, just set it up, do whatever interactions you do. Like, let me see what it looks like. And I remember mom bringing out a tray that had 3 bowls of puree. Each bowl had a different spoon in it, and she had a timer. And she said the mealtime is scoop, hold it in front, and take a bite. She hit the timer. You have 10 seconds to swallow. Otherwise, she was going to ignore him. And if you did swallow, then you got like a toy for a minute, and then, or for like 10 seconds. And then it was the next bowl, and then the next bowl. And it was like, that was a meal. And it's like, okay, we do have more bites accepted, but none of this is leading toward functional, independent eating, increased enjoyment around meal times. The caregiver feeling less stressed. If anything, they're more stressed because they're trying to keep up with all the different things. And it just, so it on paper, it looked like what was being done was working. And
and it was working. It was working at making the child accept more bites in that
what it said.
But is that what you want out of therapy? Like, is that what you're looking for? Yeah.
Yeah. And that
work or effective, that is all tied up into what the metric, what the outcome measurement that is being used is. And that's why it's so critical to look at it in the research. And we talked about this a little bit in NICU as well.
Yes.
Where a lot of the metrics, for political reasons, the main success metric is often length of stay. And that is a very important success metric for hospitals, because the shorter the length of stay, the cheaper it is for them. And so it's no shade on researchers for using length of stay as a metric, because that is what is going to get things implemented into hospitals from top levels, because they're going to go, look, this is going to save us money, so let's start implementing this. But when we're looking,
and I think also earlier from what you said about like funding the research too, length of stay is a measurement that's going to get funding.
Exactly. Yeah, it's going to appeal to doctors who are looking at research grants and going, oh, it decreases length of stay. Excellent. It's always like an old white man voice.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we're looking at an individual infant in front of us, are we thinking about whether the feeding intervention that we're delivering is going to decrease length of stay, or are we thinking about whether it's going to create a bonding mealtime opportunity between the parent and the child, or whether it's going to result in them being more efficient so that they can, happily take more of their volume orally before falling asleep? Or, you might have lots of goals depending on what, you're talking about with the family and what the child looks like, but probably relatively few of them are going to be length of stay. It's going to be a secondary goal for you, more likely.
I think too, and I had written this one down after we had talked about the NICU, one that I have also seen pretty frequently is like time it takes to wean from a tube feed. And the amount of time, from this type of intervention versus this one to get a child 100% off of a tube. And what I find is, again, we have to reflect on like, okay, the outcome measurement was time off the tube. The outcome measurement was not child is independently self-feeding or is demonstrating enjoyment around meal times, or that the child is an active participant, or that they're eating a variety, none of those mattered. What mattered was like just getting them off the tube. And so again, reflecting on that a little bit, because if the goal is to get them off the tube, then it's like, well, maybe we just want them to drink one formula, they're getting the calories orally, and that's all that matters. And then, and that's fine if that's what the caregivers want. That's what they want to work toward. And, you know, helping them recognize, like, if we go with this type of approach and down this, you know, avenue, and that's the ultimate goal right now, then if you also are wanting to build skill or variety or, you know, increase independence or self-feeding, those might have to be on hold for a little bit if we're putting all of our attention there. Or if we're not worried about it being the least amount of days possible, then we can navigate, you know, both of them together. And so that's kind of where it goes into like some of what the research says about tube weaning approaches, but also aligning that with, again, the caregivers' outcome measurements. So taking the two together.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It just feels like something that we're not often taught to critique in research papers, right? Like, you know, that you look at the methods
just
and
the
they're like,
results and go.
and like, is the, you know, what's the sampling like, and how big was the sample, and what sorts of kids did it have in it? And then we're like, okay, yep, no, can critique all of that. It was a small study that only looked at, you know, one particular group of children, and then we just completely ignore the measurement part of it, even though that has really real and important clinical implications for us when we're interpreting that data into our caseload.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think those are both great points, and kind of leads us into, I have some rapid fire questions for you. So I do not prepare anyone for these. I just kind of come up with 2 or 3 that I think would be fun for you to answer. So one that I do tend to ask a lot of people, but I think it's really interesting to hear, and it also selfishly adds to my list. But what is either like your current favorite book or your favorite children's book? You can answer either one of those.
Oh man. So I've just come back from a 3-week holiday and I got to do lots of reading, which was so amazing. And probably when I was away, I think my favorite book that I read then, like choosing a favorite book is like choosing a favorite child.
I know, that's I'm like your current favorite book.
Exactly. I like that. But when I was away, I think my top pick was a book called Priory of the Orange Tree. I am a big fantasy reader. I love fantasy.
I didn't know that about you.
Yeah. And this is like a doorstop. Like it's a big book, and it's got a prequel, and the prequel is maybe even better. Like they're both just really good. But it's pitched by the author as like a feminist retelling of St. George and the Dragon. But it's so much more complex than that. And what I am loving about like reading contemporary fantasy now as well is that it's so much more representative than it used to be. So it's this amazing, rich fantasy world that includes, you know, that has lots of women doing all sorts of different roles, not just being, you know, like the Eowyn, Lord of the Rings, embroidering banners when everyone's doing important stuff. So it's got women in really powerful roles, but it also includes lots of people of color, trans people, non-binary people, as part of sort of and queer people, as part of like the core set of characters doing really important things. And I just find that so amazing to read. But also the story is just it's just a cracking story and kind of epic, and yeah, I just loved it. Anyway, that's a very long answer.
Orange and the Prairie?
Priory of the Orange Tree.
Prairie of the Orange Tree. Okay.
Priory. So a priory like where nuns and stuff might hang out.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, prairie?
Prairie? House on the prairie?
How would you transcribe it in standard American English? Okay, my next question.
We have a non-rhotic R, right? Priory.
Yep. Oh my goodness. Okay, next question is, what is it? Because you're in Australia and I'm coming to Australia in March, which I'm so excited about. But what is a snack that I need to try while I'm there?
Oh, okay. Like the classic one is Tim Tams if you come to Australia.
Tim Tams. Okay.
Tim Tams. So they're biscuits, they're like layers of wafer, and they're chocolate covered, and they're really delicious. And like the FIFA Women's World Cup, I saw this video of like all of the Australian women like coming out after a match, or I don't know, for a PR or something. And an Australian out there like giving them like a salute and then opening their hand to reveal that they had a wrapped Tim Tam, and like all of the Australian like oh yeah, everyone loves a Tim Tam. And you can do this thing called a Tim Tam slam, where you bite each end off the Tim Tam and then like suck a sweet drink through it, and then it makes the inside all like mushy and delicious, and then you eat the Tim Tam. So good.
That sounds so good. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
excited to try that one.
Also fairy bread. You should try fairy bread.
I have been dying to try fairy bread ever since I saw, who was it? Was it Holly that posted it one time? I think there was like a birthday, and I was like, what is
It's
fairy
so good.
bread? I'm very excited.
It's the taste of an 80s and 90s Australian childhood. And then I know you only asked for one, but I will say that I brought over some Australian treats to America last year, and some of my workmates tried them, and they were all very into lamingtons. So even though that's not what I would have picked, maybe you want to try lamington, which is like it's like a sponge cake with jam in it, and the outside is covered in like chocolate and coconut.
That sounds delicious. So I might, I think I'm going to need to try that. I think I'll need to
you got like a top 3 list. Come to my house, and I will serve you just a dinner of Tim Tam's fairy bread and lamingtons.
That sounds perfect. I love it. I love it. Okay. Is there anything else? Any other closing points you want to bring up that you feel like we didn't hit on? I feel like we got.
I don't think so. And I'm so happy that we had that digression into talking about therapy notes, because it's something that I hadn't even thought to talk about, but now I'm obsessed, and I'm going to talk to everyone.
And I'm obsessed now. Now I'm like going to go like review every note I've ever written. I love it. Well, thank you.
Right. Interesting.
I know. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me again. Every time we talk, I learn something new, and I appreciate that so much about you. But I hope that you all enjoyed listening, and till next time, I'm sure you'll be back. You'll be back.
Oh, I'll be back. I'm like a boomerang. You can't get rid of me.
I know. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Feeding Pod this week. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't hesitate to share this podcast with your friends and colleagues, and leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening from. If you're interested in learning more about pediatric feeding and swallowing, be sure to follow me, on Instagram at Pediatric Feeding SLP, or check out my website where you can get access to more courses and information, www.pediatricfeedingslp.com. Again, thanks for being here and listening to my ramblings, and I hope you'll keep listening. Until next time, cheers.